Great. Well, thank you very much, Ben. Can you all hear me?
We hear you loud and clear.
Great. Wonderful. Well, I mean, as a good number of you know, I've written quite a bit about machine ethics and at least mapping that as a field. But from the very beginning, there was a distinction between machine ethics and what went under the nomenclature of friendly AI, which was Eliezer Yudkowsky's term. And I think their focus, and I think the focus for many of you, is very much on AGI systems and how we can ensure that they will be sensitive to human considerations and factor them into their choices and actions, where the early machine ethics community was much more focused upon how do we even begin to implement sensitivity to moral considerations and factoring those into choices and actions for very low-level systems. Well, regardless of which community you're in, you get into some of these lower-level considerations when you're trying to implement those sensitivities into the AI. So I think in the end, on a practical level, it all converges. But that doesn't alter the fact that we've still got a bifurcation going on in the discussion, whereby, for example, Stuart Russell will be talking about the control problem, or many of you are talking about the control problem for advanced systems and how you might get the appropriate sensitivity or awareness of human ethics into those systems. But again, it's always dependent upon certain jumps forward in terms of our ability to realize artificial general intelligence, at least, if not artificial and super intelligence. Now, we've all been lost in this conversation for years over what these terms actually mean and when they apply and when they don't apply. And for many people, I see the AGI nomenclature being defined in ways in which, if you have very smart machines that have comparable to human intelligence and a degree of agency, then they are AGIs. Well, I've always been the friendly skeptic of whether that, first of all, is AGI, or whether that can be realized without these moral sensitivities or these ethical sensitivities within the machines. And I've defined that skepticism in terms of friendly to the engineering spirit that you all have, that advanced systems can be realized, but skeptical that we know how to proceed. And it's one thing if you're talking about the ability to act as if or come up with decisions that seem to reflect the situation at hand and propose appropriate actions within those systems. And it's something else if you start throwing around these words like compassion, moral intelligence, moral exemplars, the qualities, intelligences, and the characteristics that we look to to be within the best among us, or the most sensitive among us, as we try and navigate the very difficult uncertainties of a moral life or the good life, or whatever languages you want to get involved in. So it's one thing if you're talking about a machine that processes ostensibly moral input and comes up with an action or response that falls within the acceptable levels of responses for us. And it's something else when you want the machine to actually have the aptitudes or the characteristics of which, again, compassion or empathy becomes sort of the more grandiose.
Well, I mean, is this sort of the qualia problem in a slightly different guise? I mean, are you expressing just a doubt that these engineered systems can really experience anything?
It's the qualia problem, but I think it's the qualia problem on steroids, because you don't care whether they have the qualia per se, but you do in a sense want to know, is this really compassion, or does it just sort of look like compassion? So we know now that we have human psychopaths or sociopaths. Different people use different terms. Sociopath seems to be the more acceptable these days, that are very good at deducing the affective qualities and the theory of mind, the intentions of those they're interacting with. And depending on what the goal of the sociopath is, they are able to give responses even though they may lack the affective.
So you're worried that it's possible that the engineered AGI or quasi-AGIs won't have qualia, and B, it's possible they'll have qualia, but they'll be like engineered sociopaths that have qualia, but not compassionate qualia.
Exactly. So it can go either way. And then then you have kind of the ex machina problem where she persuades the guy that she likes him, but again, it's only for her own ends and her own purposes. So she knows what the affective qualities are that the other is looking for, but is not necessarily interested in having those qualities or even the meaning of those qualities. So for me, this has always been the problem of the difference between machines that can act as if they give appropriate responses and machines that actually embody not just the qualia, but the full embodied sense of what the appropriate response is. And again, I don't think it's just qualia, because I think the qualia in this particular situation is the embodiment of not just the appropriate response, but the embodiment of the kinds of intelligence we're looking for in any advanced entity, whether that's an intelligent human being or that would be an intelligent machine. And to just finish with one final point before we go on to the others' input, the way I look at it is compassion, empathy, it's all part and parcel of what it means to be an integrated human being. Now, most of us don't function as very integrated. We're pretty fragmented, in fact, and therefore can act with great care in certain circumstances and act very violently in other circumstances. But the very nature of evolution is that it was going stage after stage with largely integrated biological beings that were, in effect, their success depended upon their ability to be integrated both internally and in their adaptive response to the environment and the other entities that shared that environment. The difficulty we have with artificial intelligence is that integration doesn't come from the get-go. We create a lot of discrete systems and we try and integrate them after the fact. But in at least the evolutionary realm, integration was the determination of success, or at least one of the background determinations that we often overlook.
I would have some things to say about that, but before plunging in, I would love to hear what Julia has to say, either in response to your thoughts or just on AI ethics and what should be attended to in this domain now by folks in the AGI field. So yeah, welcome, Julia. You're sounding very quiet, like you may be muted.
My headphones, is this better?
That is much louder. We can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. But you'll have to hear my little time machine in the closet. So every once in a while that'll happen. So I agree that there's this bifurcation that Wendell was talking about. And that's really important for people in the AGI. So I'm coming from the outside of the AGI world. My background's in cognitive neuroscience, and I do work in experimental psychology and models of transformation, human transformation. And do some, apparently, quantum mechanics. But it's really important, I think, for people in the AGI world who are seeking, who really feel strongly that AGI is going to be an important solution for humanity, to determine whether they're working to create, I mean, I'm sure this has been said before. In fact, I think Ben has said this several times, but maybe not, working to create something that is going to help humans do a better job of being human and compassionate and beneficial and have beneficial actions. In which case, AGI is like the printing press. So here's a revolutionary technology that actually helped humanity pass down information, even if a particular generation didn't believe the information or couldn't read the information. It was passed down and saved for a future generation. And I think AGI could work like that. I think AGI could work like a repository for information that even if the current generation can't interpret it or use it wisely, the future generation could. So I think that's one branch, but another branch is to create something that actually knows more than we do. In other words, to include in the list of things that AGI can help us with, understanding how to be super compassionate, understanding how to experience unconditional love. And in fact, not just understanding it, but experiencing it. So an AGI as essentially a mother, father, parent figure. So an AGI raising us. So and what I think is, and I think this probably comes from my very deep interest in how time works, but what I think has to be considered is this idea of circular causation. So this idea that we could create a baby AGI, we've talked about that before, that we're very patient with, because we have to have faith that it's designed well enough so that it has the tools to learn over a much longer period of time than we want. Because guess what? Nature has figured out how to create intelligence, and it takes much longer than we think it should take. And so having that patience, especially when we're not giving it the right inputs, we don't even know what the right inputs are. We're giving clunky inputs into the system. Even if we try to mimic the inputs that we think a baby is getting, we're still giving clunky inputs because, and this comes to the other point that I want to make, one of the other 2 points. We're still giving clunky inputs because what we're including is the inputs that are visible. So we still have this materialist bias that says the only thing that really exists is an action or a perception. And a perception is an internal replication of what's going on in the 3D reality. An action is an influence of the 3D reality. But there's almost zero acknowledgement. In this community, there's much more, but there's almost zero acknowledgement in sort of traditional AI communities that what's going on in the interpersonal space is a thing. It's a real thing that has content that's different from an action or a perception. And if you don't model the internal space and you don't use that as an input, good luck raising minds. And so, I mean, you can watch, you can read developmental psychology, you can see how minds are raised. So, and you can see how minds are raised to be compassionate, how minds are raised to be sociopathic. And without accessing that interpersonal, it's qualia on both sides, right? It's qualia on both sides, and it's a third thing, it's an interpersonal qualium. And so without using those as inputs and without creating a structure that we have so much faith in that we're willing to let it sit for years and learn very slowly and make lots of mistakes and not narrow its view, not create all these narrow AIs that are basically like cutting off an infant on day 2. Without doing that, I think that we're never going to get there. And I think with doing that, if we're going to use a parental model where the folks who are feeding in the information are understand what the experience of unconditional love is like, understands what the experience of interpersonal qualium is like, understands how to access an experience of hyper acceptance of what is and what this baby AGI is doing. If the parents can be like that, and I'm referring to the coders as parents here, because I think that's the proper model. If the parents are doing that, then I think what you get is a baby that can do that, because that's the input it's getting.
And you're projecting in that case, you'll get real understanding and compassion rather than simulated understanding and compassion.
So here's what I say about all that. So I can't prove that anyone else and I can't prove that myself, I can't prove that any of us are compassionate, or that any of us frankly are conscious, or that I was conscious 2 seconds ago. Like, this is all back to the zombie stuff, right? You can't prove any of that. But the point is, we still have a name for something called compassion, and it's an experience. And we can call certain acts compassionate and then call the same act psychopathic based on how we experience the person in the act. So if a parent kills a child, a human child, for instance, to take something very extreme, if we then look at the larger picture and we realize that child was going to be suffocated in a gas chamber, then we go, oh, maybe this was a compassionate act. And we have a sense of that that's different from the same act in which the parent's a psychopath and is killing the child. So what I'm saying is, ask your question again, because I got off on this child killing thing and then I couldn't come back.
Well, yeah, well, I was just, you were speaking in a way that was assuming that if the programmers raise the AI right and they have the right sort of, connection with the AI, that there's going to be sort of collective qualia between the programmers and AI teachers and the AI. And then out of all that, the baby AGI will come out of it with
that's the hope. I mean,
maybe even super compassion compared to human compassion. But now, if I went back to Wendell's earlier comments, he was interrogating, in what sense is that real super compassion versus maybe fake sociopathic super compassion.
Yeah, I don't care. So I don't care because it's not testable. But what's testable is, and what we know is true, is that when parents who have access to that space raise children, the children are more likely to have access to that space.
So that will be a question to throw back to Wendell, but I want to let Seth join the conversation first. Is it, in what way could the distinctions that he's making be made testable? But let's move on to Seth, who has
before I do that,
wrap up, please.
Yeah, I just want to wrap up. The last point that at some point I would love to talk about in this panel is this issue of unconscious versus conscious that didn't get enough of a fair shake in the earlier panel, I think with Gabriel, and I wanted to bring it back and what it has to do with compassion and training AGI to be compassionate. So anyway,
great. So let's let's do that. So Seth, I'm not sure you're sharing your video, are you? There we go. There, your Sethness is in fuller glory now for all of YouTube to see.
Okay,
you've got a totally different view on this. So to go back to the beginning, my high level sort of poke here was regarding AI ethics. So what do you think are key issues or aspects there that the AGI community and AGI developers should be paying more attention to now? What should they be thinking about now?
Okay. And first, is my audio working?
Yeah.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you. All right. Well, and thanks for inviting me to participate in the panel. My background is, well, it's interdisciplinary, but it's centered on risk analysis. I work on global catastrophic risk. My group's the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, gcrinstitute.org if you want to look it up. And for most of this work, the theme of compassion is actually not, I would say, not very important. Okay, it can be a motivator for caring about the risk of global catastrophe, but that only gets you so far. So, for example, the world is trying to deal with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and ultimately, we don't need compassion, we need a vaccine. And the work that we need to do to get that vaccine can be motivated by compassion, but it can probably also be motivated by windfall profits and Nobel Prizes and all sorts of other things that we can offer in return for a good vaccine to this terrible virus. In some cases, compassion may even potentially serve as a distraction or as a counterproductive way of thinking for global catastrophic risk, or at least something in that direction. What I'm thinking of here in the psychology of risk perception, there are concepts like scope insensitivity and psychic numbing, in which people are less responsive to risks of a higher severity. So people may be just as concerned about an event that would result in 2,000 deaths as they are in an event that would result in 200,000 deaths. There is a great quote that's attributed to Stalin, but apparently Stalin didn't actually say this. But it's often, it would make a lot of sense if Stalin did actually say this, that a single death is a tragedy and a million deaths is a statistic. And that really does, even though it may be a misplaced quote, it really does capture some central elements of human thinking. And so for most of the work that I do, a concept like compassion is relatively unimportant. You don't need to be that compassionate to be concerned about global catastrophes. These are kind of obviously a bad thing, and it's just a question of what it takes to avoid them or to work your way out of them if they occur. AI is an exception. So, okay, you don't need that much compassion to worry about an AI that's going to, get out of control and destroy everything, destroy ourselves and everything we might care about. But there are two other issues there, and I think that compassion could play a role for both of them. So one is, how do you design an AI to avoid that sort of outcome, the catastrophic outcome? And the other is, if you do have an AI that is safe, that would not do that, then what do you do with it? What sorts of goals do you try to pursue? I mean, presumably we should want it to advance or help advance some notion of moral good, but there are a lot of notions of moral good out there, and given the chance to take one notion or one suite of notions and then amplify it with an AGI, what do we choose? That is a very important question that goes beyond the just a major catastrophe would be a bad thing. And I would say that the concept of compassion would seem to factor into both the AGI safety, like how do you design the AGI so that it could avoid a catastrophe, and then also the ethics. So given that it's safe, what should we try to do with the AGI system? So my intuition here, and on this I feel less confident in my own intuition, but my intuition is that a compassionate AGI would tend to also be a safe AGI. My sense is that an AGI that has mastered compassion with all its subtleties and nuances should probably also be able to avoid the sorts of pathologies that would end in catastrophe. Now, I suppose this gets into questions of how compassion is to be defined, but I would think that for a more robust definition that's at least somewhat analogous to human compassion, an AGI that has compassion in that sense is more likely to be safe. Now, second, with respect to the ethics, a compassionate AGI would have some built-in moral hardware that can then be used to advance a range of notions of moral good, I would say. And what I'm getting at here is that the compassion is something that can motivate an entity, whether it's a human or an AI, to take moral actions, but is not necessarily the whole of morality on its own. And so if we have an AGI with compassion, then this raises some further questions. First of all, compassionate for whom or for what? And these are questions that I think don't have overwhelmingly obvious answers that everyone would just naturally agree with. This gets into some actually quite contentious areas, like should the AGI only care about those that are in its immediate vicinity, that it's having more immediate interactions with, or should it care about the wider space of beings around the world? Should it care about only things now versus in the distant future? Should it only care about humans? versus non-human entities? Does it care about other AIs? Does it care about itself? These are all very difficult questions that the compassion itself only gets to part of it. And then secondly, does the feeling of compassion, if we can call it a feeling, and this gets into questions of sentience and is it actual compassion versus the appearance of compassion that I think are all very important topics to be discussing. But given that it feels or does something in the vicinity of feeling compassion, does this feeling of compassion compel behavior, or is it just a feeling? And my intuition here, and I feel more confident on this one, my intuition here is that ultimately we should be thinking of compassion as a building block for moral AGI instead of seeing it as the whole of AGI morality on its own, that compassion may be an important element to work on for designing an AI that would be a moral system, but that we're going to need a lot more than just that.
Well, thanks, Seth. Yeah, and I think I mean my first reaction hearing you talk was sort of off to the side of the theme of this panel, because I feel intuitively quite strongly that if we want to combat global existential risks in general, even not just regarding AGI, but in general, to me, the absolute most useful thing we could do would be to propagate more compassion among humanity. And I would think that just indirectly will cause a lot fewer nasty things to happen, because to my mind, it's uncompassionate motives of humans that are causing most of these nasty things that are potentially dangerous to us. But then that leads on to deeper questions also, which I want to turn to. So what I would like to ask you guys now is really also raised by some of the points you mentioned. So what actually is this compassion thing that we're talking about, and which I sort of pulled together this workshop around? I mean, as you pointed out, human compassion has its peculiarities, right? Like every time I visit sub-Saharan Africa, I start giving money to sick, poor people in the street, and then I send much less money to them when I get back home to Hong Kong or US, right? So my human compassion, I'm a fairly compassionate person, but my human compassion has weird biases that I'm well aware of, and they're just part of who I am. On the other hand, I had several old aunts when I was a kid who I think thought they were being compassionate toward me, like they sort of cared about me. They said that they felt like they wanted what was best for me, but they systematically did things that were really annoying to me anyway, because their model of me was like utterly flawed and off from the reality. And they didn't seem to try that hard to figure out what I actually wanted or what would make me happy either. So I was never sure, were they really compassionate toward me, or did they like that story in their mind that they were compassionate or something? And so I think the nature of compassion and the relation of compassion to theory of mind and modeling of other minds is even confusing within the human sphere, and more confusing when you get onto non-human minds. So it will be interesting to hear what you guys think about, what is compassion that an AGI might hypothetically engineer or be evolved to embody it. And I guess we can rotate around again and start with Wendell again.
Okay, well, I thought I wanted to hear from the others first, but that's fine. I do agree with you, Ben, by the way. I also think that it's the absence of compassion, which is a lot of the reason why we have these existential risks. On the other hand, I also agree with Seth that the ways in which we're going to identify many of these risks, it's not the same as the one-on-one interaction between human beings, or maybe even between an AGI and a human when we think about ethics on the level of governance and countries in the world, that oftentimes figuring out the best way forward starts with some utilitarian calculations. And if compassion comes in, it only comes in after we think we have a relatively good course, and then we start to think about the trade-offs of that course and who might be harmed if we pursue our method of attending to to humanity at large, at whose expense, or where's the trade-off. I don't have some simple definition of what compassion is. I think compassion falls very much in the realm of qualities such as consciousness. We don't know exactly what it is, we can't define it, but most of us know that we are conscious. We don't necessarily know why or how we're conscious, and most of us don't even spend a significant amount of introspective time trying to see what we can grok about the very nature of our consciousness. So some people like myself, I've been meditating for more than 50 years now. What is consciousness and what can be apprehended by the human? That's something I've given a lot of attention to, as I have with compassion. But I don't claim to have some definition of what it is, but I do think it again has something to do with the openness and integration of an embodied mind that allows others to act upon it in a way where it can deduce or feel or share with others a pretty close semblance of what they also are feeling and I mean, more than feeling, perhaps, what their intentions and goals are. But nobody's psychic in the sense that they get this right all the time. So it's obviously a faculty, but it's not some kind of a faculty that is without flaws. I happen to think that, though, it is a special faculty in that its manifestation has an awful lot to do with having a kind of quiet, integrated, open relationship to life and all the forces that impinge upon us in the act of living. So without a definition, I do think there are certain prerequisites for compassion at its best. And oftentimes when we talk about compassion, it's more like our stumbling in terms of, well, once we have that feeling, what do we do with it? Do we give money to the beggar on the street or don't we? But that's after the fact.
Mm-hmm. Julia?
Sure. So lots of ideas here. I think that I agree with you, Ben, that compassion is like one of the foundational pieces, that if you can hack compassion into the system, then you get a lot for that. And what it is, to me, it is acceptance of what is and a heartfelt, benevolent desire that other beings that you're being compassionate for will have their greatest good. So
what does heartfelt mean for an AGI system with no heart in the physical sense?
Exactly. So if you're an embodied system, there's these experiences that you have that I believe need to be modeled in the AGI so that it can experience something like compassion. So I think that an embodied approach is really important, but I also think, and frankly, having compassion, I think it's very difficult to have compassion if you don't have a sense of your own mortality or don't have a sense of your own potential weakness or frailty. So, so those things, in other words, so I believe compassion is a model of mind of the other person in which the other person is modeled in a positive light. So whatever's going on for them, whatever is making them upset or hurting them, your model of them is that things could be better for them, and that you want to see what you can do to try to help that happen, rather than your model. It's a benefit of the doubt model. So like your aunts were only being compassionate if they were to have the feeling of, we want what's best for Ben, and we think what's best for Ben is this haircut, but that's a great feeling. But then the action of saying, and we're now going to tell you that this haircut is best for you, that falls short of compassion, because the proper response would have been, Ben, what do you think the best haircut is for you? And I see this, and this comes back to Seth, what you were saying, which is that, yeah, you can get this, we can solve COVID without compassion. And you totally can solve COVID without compassion. You can solve a lot of problems without compassion. But if we keep solving problems without compassion, it's a bit like the parent who says, when I spank my child, I get a good response. They stop doing the thing that they did just before I spanked them. That's behaviorism, right? And so it's like, yeah, it works. It totally works, but it doesn't add more love to the world. And adding a baseline sort of DC shift of love in the world is, I think, like the bottleneck to trying to make anything, whether it's a machine, an algorithm, or even some soup, anything that actually supports life and love. So I think it's really important that we look at who we are if we're going to be making technology, and stop assuming that sort of pride and the arrogance of us thinking we're so smart is actually a good way to motivate people. I think that's really important to think about.
All right, Seth, I know I've intentionally sort of thrown you in the den of lovey-dovey wolves here. I mean, I knew you had a somewhat different view, which makes the conversation more interesting. So, and I know compassion isn't, as you said, not the center of what your thinking has been about anyway. But any further thoughts you have would certainly be interesting.
No, sure, and I can speak to both the point about, like, do you need compassion to get out of the pandemic, and also the role of compassion within an AGI, because the same sort of idea comes to mind for me for both of this. So yes, compassion can be helpful for addressing issues like global catastrophic risk, but I will reiterate that a lot of the work a lot of what we need is, compassion only gets you so far. Like, compassion doesn't get you a vaccine. Like, molecular biology gets you a vaccine, and the compassion can motivate the molecular biology, but you still actually have to do the molecular biology. And if you don't, then you don't get the vaccine. And it's not just molecular biology; it's all the other stuff that goes into a vaccine. That's very, very technical work that can be motivated by compassion. Maybe can be motivated, at least to an extent, without compassion. But at the end of the day, you still need to do all of that molecular biology and all of that other work. That's the point that I'm making. I'm not going to dispute that compassion can be a valuable motivator for this. I think one of the points I was making was that there can be circumstances in which compassion can make the risk of global catastrophe worse. Let me give you an example. People may be compassionate about their own family and therefore want to keep their own family safe, and therefore decide to drive around in an SUV instead of walking and taking the bus and so on. And that happens to increase the risk of global warming, motivated through compassion to one's immediate family. And it's, we don't want to criticize compassion for the family, but at the same time, it is causing problems with respect to global warming when people behave in that sort of way. And this gets to the point that I was making before about compassionate for whom and for what. And this is a really important question that needs to go into our ethics in general, and certainly also the ethics that we might have for an AGI. Now, with respect to an AGI, let me put this out here. One perspective on, so what would compassion actually look like? When I think about it, I'm imagining a mental model of some other entity, and the entity could be a single being, a human, your pet dog, what have you, or it could be something much broader than that. You could have compassion for an entire population or for the entirety of existence, if you'd like. A mental model of some other entity, and then some kind of a sense of identification with that or caring for that such that your own values map to your mental model of that other entity. I'm trying to break down compassion in terms that might be more conducive to actually writing into some computer code. That's one way I might imagine compassion instantiating itself within an AGI. Now, this is very speculative. A lot of the people here are going to know the computer science details of it a lot better than I can, but that's how I might imagine it. Now, one interesting aspect of that, to go back to the point about scale, this is the one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. Something interesting about AGI is that potentially it would have the capacity to do that individual level, one death is a tragedy sort of compassion, but do that at a much larger scale. As a human being, I have a hard time feeling for a million deaths in the way that I feel for one death. It's just, despite what I do for a living, despite how much this perspective of caring about massive catastrophes really drives my moral thinking, still I'm a human just like everybody else, and I can't care about a million deaths the way I care about the one death of that specific person who has a story and so on. Maybe that could be different for an AGI that has the cognitive capacity to have that individual scale compassion, but at a larger scale. So, Ben, you told the story of you start donating to anti-poverty charities after visiting sub-Saharan Africa. It makes perfect sense. And we could imagine an AGI would be able to latch onto an experience like that and keep that with them even after they have gone back to the US and Hong Kong or wherever else they might be. And likewise to be able to take that type of moral feeling and scale it up within their minds in a way that a human would not be able to. That to me is a really intriguing aspect of how an AGI might be able to instantiate compassion.
Yeah, I think obviously loads and loads of technical details to realize that in any particular AGI architecture, but I think the concept is interesting, and there's representations and sort of learning mechanisms that have to exist inside the AGI system. And then, as Julia was highlighting, there are types of interactions that have to occur as well to get those internal mechanisms in proper use. So I think with the remaining,
let me bring in just a distinction that goes on here. There is a term in the philosophy of embodiment and cognition that says the world is its own best model. And I think compassion has something to do with our ability to apprehend the world outside of ourselves. And the language of mental representations that we build internally may be natural for the AGI world and the computational world, but it also may be why the way in which we are thinking about AGI and the value of bringing up a concept, and I don't think it's a concept, but a reality like compassion actually is pushing toward a different model of what's going on in interaction than the one that is normally presumed by the AGI world, or even the biological world that wants to see everything as totally contained. And I think Julia was trying to kind of nudge us in that direction when she was talking about the space of interrelationship.
Yeah, this reminds me of issues we came up with in working with Hanson Robotics and Sophia, which Julia was involved with a bit. I mean, I mean, David Hanson has been animated from the beginning of his career with wanting to make compassionate, compassionate, loving machines. But when you're dealing with the realities of engineering a robot, I mean, we're faced with a bunch of really annoying problems. Like, there's no good way to give the robot skin. There's no good way to give the robot like kinesthesia or sense inside its body. I mean, there are conceivable ways to do it, but when you're actually in the robot lab, there's no practical, like reasonably inexpensive and reliable way to do it. So I mean, you have a robot that you can't caress her back and she feels it, and she can't put her hand on you if you're feeling nervous and feel your breathing in the palm of her hand. And if a servo in her elbow breaks, the only way she'll notice it is by observing that visually, like the arm didn't move when she sent the move command. She doesn't like feel that it's not moving, right? And these are not fundamental issues. Like, it's easy to envision engineering solutions to all of them, but there are issues with the technology right now. And I think if these sorts of things were surmounted, we could go further toward giving embodied AGIs like a human-like experience of the world, and then a human-like experience of each other and of humans, which would go a significant way toward creating the conditions for, compassion to emerge and sort of be learned and evolve within the AGI's minds. Now, what is a doubt in my mind is, okay, without this kind of human-like embodiment, but with embodiment in the internet, which has a huge amount of sensors and actuators of different types, maybe some other kind of compassionate experience can like emerge in the AIs we have now. But then it's so different from us, we can't empathize with it or vice versa, right? But actually, let me go to some questions from the audience. Here's a sort of a easy one. If integration enabled by ethics and compassion is better than barriers, and if humanity manages to learn that over and over, then why can't AGI do that integration with almost zero special effort to ensure that? Julia.
So the fact that we've learned it over and over means that we didn't learn it, right? I mean, so if you have to learn something over and over, you didn't learn it. So it's actually a hard thing to learn if you have a body and if that body can die, because you want to erect barriers for survival. If you have an urge for survival, which is a sane thing to have if you have a body and if it can die. So, so I would argue that if you go with an AGI that Ben was discussing, where the body is the internet, which is one way to go, I think it's going to learn very quickly. I mean, I think it's easy to learn that the great idea is to integrate everything. And in fact, that's what it would be doing.
One thing that popped into my head here, when I look at Jeffrey Martin did a whole complex psychological study of people experiencing various advanced stages of persistent non-symbolic experience, sort of AKA enlightenment, to use a less technical term. But one thing he found was that people who were very far along this spectrum of non-attachment and non-symbolic experience did not perceive themselves as a unity. Like, as he would put it, they sort of lost the illusion of their unity, and they more
felt disconnected.
They experienced themselves more as, a set of clusters of behavior patterns.
Yeah, like they were watching a movie.
Yeah, I mean, and I've had that myself sometimes, where you go through a long period, like viewing yourself from a top-down third-person view instead of a first-person view, as if you yourself were a character in movies. So that's not unity, actually. That's it can be a compassionate state of consciousness, yet a radically disunified one. So I'm a little conflicted about the role of unity here.
I think that misunderstands what unity means in this context.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's totally consistent with a unity, but it's not about a unity of the organism, or that I am unified or identified with the organism as an organism. So it's very common things that happen in meditation for many people That, I mean, the language I use is you just experience yourself as a nexus of consciousness in a sea of relationships. But the sea of relationships is what's important here, not what's going on in your body. Your body is nothing more than that, than a sensation machine that is giving you feedback of how effectively you are engaged, present in that sea of relationships.
Oh,
So the
disagree.
unity isn't necessarily the individual sort of ego unity or the body unity. It can be a broader sort of unity than
But I think there's a body unity there. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying the fact that when you're talking about that people who move into non-symbolic states, seeing their body mainly as a sensation machine, that's not inconsistent with also a qualitative state that is not defined by the body. The body is merely the nexus of a nexus in this system of unified dynamics.
Well,
This is
I think
kind of simplistic ways of trying to talk about something. I was just trying to point out that I thought that you'd given a representation of what that all meant that is highly disputed in terms of perhaps what the experience is for people who are, you know, who are actively engaged in exploring states of mind.
if you, I mean, and I think that there's another problem with the question is that equating the non-symbolic persistent experience people who have been through that in Jeffrey's study with people who are fully compassionate is something that's often done in the New Age movement, that, you know, if you get super enlightened, you're super compassionate. But if you've ever talked to those people, and I have, they themselves don't see themselves as super compassionate, and you don't experience them as super compassionate.
Yeah.
No,
So
there's not a 100% correlation. And what's one of the nice things in Jeffrey's study is he highlights the wild diversity among these people, both in terms of their type of non-symbolic state of consciousness and the way it manifests in their lives. And some are very highly compassionate and some are not. And I guess this Wendell, you weren't there for, but in the previous panel we had a bunch of discussion about non-ordinary and psychedelic states of consciousness and how these might be realized in open-ended AGI systems of various types, and the relation of various states of consciousness human minds can get into and human bodies get into, and compassion is very subtle, and that's just within humans. So if you open that up to non-human intelligences, I mean, I think we don't have the theoretical or practical basis to understand what would be the relation of the different states of consciousness of AGI systems and their levels of compassion.
And the variety of states of minds available to humans are perhaps infinite in and of themselves. I mean, there's been some fascinating research on consciousness that just shows that some of our basic assumptions about what others are experiencing just aren't true. That there are rich ways of engaging and responding. And perhaps the most interesting point is that we have a capacity for a vast array of these. And it's not that one's enlightened or another's compassionate, or, you know, I mean, these are just words we have fabricated as a way of trying to capture qualities, qualia, if you like, that that we can discriminate with, but in the actual act of living and engaging and interacting, they have so many combinations and qualities and revelations that our language is pretty insufficient to even talk about.
Yeah. So, Julia, I know before we have to call this amazing discussion to an end, you wanted to come back to something about the relation between conscious and unconscious processing that came up in the previous panel, and that I think you're going to be able to connect to the topic of this panel as well.
Yeah, sure. So again, sorry about the background noise. So we have this thing, someone asked a question in the panel about if we have some AGI that's compassionate, is it going to be naive? And there's a bias in our world where love and kindness and compassion are linked with stupidity. So there's like this, we have this continuum where we believe if you're super compassionate, you're probably stupid. If you're really smart, you're probably not compassionate. I call it the sociopathic continuum. It's not actually the case, but we do have this bias. And so, like, for instance, when Seth said, we also need the technical piece too. Of course, we need the technical piece too, but we can have both. And when you think of compassion as something that's over here, and this relates exactly to the conscious and unconscious piece as well, so I'm going to use the same sort of fist metaphor. When you think of compassion, that's something over here and has this boundary and is just a quality, like a human quality. And you think of getting things done over here. And yes, sometimes they can interact and you can use compassion as a motivator, or you can get things done that are compassionate. That's great, but that is not the way I'm certainly model compassion. I see compassion as an enveloping and an informing foundational piece. So I'm using here compassion. What I mean is unconditional love as an enveloping and informing foundational piece. And so there is no separation. If you're in it, the more you're in a state of unconditional love or compassion, all the things you do, including computer code or anything else, or molecular biology, are informed by that compassion. Now let's go to unconscious and conscious. What's your model of the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious mind? So in the neuroscientific world, the unconscious, all the things of which we are unconscious actually create our conscious experience. So in the neuroscientific world, your conscious experience is an outgrowth or an emanation from the unconscious. So if you want a certain conscious experience, which we believe is where intelligence lives, so in AGI, we're trying to create a general intelligence, right? So if we want a conscious experience that's intelligent, we better understand that the unconscious is giving rise to that. It's unfolding it, and it's from which the conscious and intelligence, conscious mind and the intelligence emerges. And so figuring out whether the coders, for instance, for an AGI are parents who are raising the AGI or are the unconscious mind, either way, whomever it is, whether it's the unconscious that's informing the conscious mind, or whether it's the parents who are teaching the child, what is the role? If those beings are people, we can't take ourselves out of the system. If those beings are coming at it with a compassionate and unconditionally loving motivation, it changes how they think and what they do. And since we are in charge of creating AGI, we have to look to ourselves to decide what role we are. If we're separate and over here, then it's not a problem. I just don't believe that's the case. I believe that what we're talking about is something that's very fundamental, the same way the unconscious mind creates the conscious mind.
Yeah, so there's a question also about the relation of empathy and compassion, and that somewhat ties into what you're talking about, I think.
Oh yeah, what's the difference between empathy and compassion?
Yeah,
So my understanding, or at least the sort of the way this people who are in the scholarly world who look at compassion and empathy talk about empathy as feeling like as if. So if I see someone who's starving on the street, I feel, oh, like what would it be like to be that person starving on the street? I'm modeling them in my body and I'm feeling what that might feel like, okay? And if I'm having compassion for them, that's the next step. So I feel that, but I don't stop there, because if I stop there, mathematically, that's really undesirable. Now you have two people who feel like crap, right? That's not great. So instead, you have the one person who's feeling like crap, and if you're feeling okay and you have the resources, you go, oh, if I were that person, I would want this other person. I recognize that I'm a different person, which is another reason, by the way, why embodiment's helpful, is this interpersonality needs different beings, right? So anyway, I realize I'm a different person, and so I can help that person. And so now I'm going to do something that comes from compassion, comes from my ability to feel connected to that person and feel like that person matters and to feel the state of that person. And now I will do an action. So to me, that's the difference. Compassion leads to action. Empathy often leads to like depression. If it doesn't.
All right, so I think we're pretty much out of time. I wanna give everyone a final chance. If you have any summary message on AGI ethics, compassion, or anything related you think is interesting to project out to the world of AGI developers. I guess we can we can randomize and go the other order this time. So Seth can go first.
Okay, well, thank you all for the very interesting discussion. I think I will be compassionate, naive, and maybe intelligent all at the same time by acknowledging that a lot of these topics are very much outside the scope of my own expertise, and I will spare you all my poor attempts at trying to add to the nuances of how compassion works in its relationship to consciousness and so on. But it's all very interesting, I guess. The theme, overarching theme related to compassion that I've been speaking to, that I would hope to leave everyone with, is the question of compassion for whom and for what, and the importance of how that question is answered.
Yeah, and is it compassion for us now or for humans in 20 years, right? So that, I mean, there's a lot of subtlety there, right? Because in the Middle Ages, if you had compassion for all the medieval Christians who were attached to their worldview, you never would have created the modern world. So these are very tricky. Right? Julia, you have any wrapping up remarks or
Sure. I mean,
super compassionate messages?
Sure. I just think that I think that having faith in the developmental process is really important here. I think you would put a parent in jail if they kept messing with the brain, if they kept opening up the skull of the child and messing around and thinking, wait, no, that wasn't the right place for the optic nerve. So I feel like,
oh, you just don't tell anyone you're doing that to your kids, Julia.
Well, I'm not going to tell them about you, Ben, but yeah, I just think that recognizing the grandiosity of thinking that you can create something that's going to be an AGI in a very short period of time without lots of trust in the system and then letting it learn all of its. I think learning is. I mean, I know you all know this, but I really think that the AGI community can sometimes think that, oh, we'll just solve it this way, and just don't. Like, let it learn. Let it give it enough data so it learns everything itself.
I mean, that's how the whole AI field has developed, right? Is to focus now much more on learning from experience, but then you come down to every learning algorithm has its own inductive biases of various sorts, right. And how the system learns and how imaginatively it's learning versus how slavishly it's sticking to the data it's seen in its learning. So you have issues at that level rather than at the level of what knowledge you code in. But still, even if any learning algorithm that's sufficiently powerful will get to the same place eventually by some theoretical arguments, I mean, eventually it is a long time. And then how the system learns makes a difference.
So I guess what I'm saying is that have some humility. I mean, the human brain took a long time to develop, and remember that one of the major outputs and the major defining factors on whether a human being gets to reproduce is this interpersonal connection, and that is a really strong output that needs to be considered. Is a learning successful? One of the first things an infant learns how to do is smile when the parent is smiling. If a learning is successful, a particular module of information is successful, if it's not judged according to its interpersonal value, it's not going to work.
Important message. And Wendell, the final summary advice or comment to you then?
Well, I'd really like Julia's point about underlining the fact that it's a developmental process and we need patience and there's a lot of learning that goes on. I also appreciate that you put this panel together because I think it's these words like compassion and love and empathy and moral intelligence and embodied virtue, and there's a whole flock of these pointers that we have that I think are important for the AGI community, because they underscore elements that, or possibilities that the way the human organism evolved could become emergent properties within human beings. And my concern is that we have AGI platforms that, because of the nature of how they are being developed, don't go through that learning process that evolution honed in bringing about the human being. And therefore, we might get very intelligent systems, but not necessarily systems that have all the quality as we had hoped for them.